Hi everyone, my name is Ziyah Johnston and my presentation will be on Allen Ginsberg's Howl and the obscenity trials that follow. While the content in the poem is certainly obscene, or one can even say vulgar, it is still a very important work of literature. The fact that it had its own trial emphasizes how much it challenged the ideals of the time. Ginsberg did not want to shy away from the truth, and he was willing to suffer the consequences for the influence of his work. One of Allen Ginsberg's most famous poems was one called Howl, which was originally published in 1956 in a collection called Howl and Other Poems. This poem was dedicated to Carl Solomon, another American writer. He began writing it in 1954, and it is synonymous with the Beat Generation, whose works explored and influenced American culture and politics in the post-war era. Howl is divided into 3 sections and a footnote. He wanted to write a poem with no restrictions and was influenced by other poets like William Carlos Williams. Ginsberg began writing the poem in septriadic, which is a long line that unfolds into 3 descending and indented parts, which Williams invented. Ginsberg then developed his own style, which is a long line based on breath organized by a fixed base or breath-length form. Howl can be described as a celebration of people who choose not to conform to American standards during the 20th century. Ginsberg highlights the bravery of those who choose to live freely and be unapologetic. For example, he celebrates being homosexual, socialist sympathizers, and people whose politics or beliefs were outside of the norm. The quote displayed comes from part 1 of Howl and is part of a long list of different kinds of people Ginsberg wanted its readers to know and recognize. All the different kinds of people addressed or described deviate from the conservative and proper way of life expected by society at the time. The language used here is very vulgar, to say the least. Imagine yourself as a reader of the times and how something like this might seriously offend someone who opposed people who were considered abnormal. Analysis of this quote could be considering the era of the time and how people were conservative or religious. It is easy to see why this quote would be considered obscene. In today's age, where music, film, and social media, or you could say vulgar, Ginsberg's words would not be as jarring or offensive if it was published today. My thesis for this project is while Ginsberg was just trying to celebrate the aspects of life that were taboo or looked down upon at the time, the execution of this poem led to hardships that diminished the meaning and significance of this poem at the time it was published. If something like this were published today, it would be seen a lot differently. However, this time era must be considered. City Lights Bookstore's co-founder Lawrence Ferlinghetti came under fire after he sold Ginsberg's poem and was arrested for selling obscenity. Judge Clayton Horn ruled that Howl and Other Poems was not obscene and ended up clearing the charges. Prior to the ruling, over 500 copies of Howl and Other Poems had been seized by a San Francisco collector of customs. Horn believed that the poem had a redeeming social importance, and he said no hard and fast rule can be fixed for the determination of what is obscene because determination depends on the locale, the time, the mind of the community, and the prevailing mores. Even the word itself has a chameleon-like history. Horn goes on to say that no two people think alike or view the world the same way, and Ginsberg is just trying to share his outlook on the world. Ginsberg himself also suffered for his writings. Author of Allen Ginsberg's Howl and A New Controversy by Aaron Yarrow said that Howl also challenged literary sensibilities with a barrage of obscenities that led to widespread attacks on Mr. Ginsberg and attempts to keep the book out of libraries and bookstores. This relates to ongoing debates today about the banning of books. Works like Howl force people who don't want to address what is difficult or taboo to analyze and even celebrate differences and challenge ideals. Even though literature may be challenging or uncomfortable to read, it is necessary to understand where authors are coming from and their motivations for creative choices to give certain messages to the public.
To Ginsberg.
You also said, I believe, literary value sometimes is a book which will survive any test of time. Do you think Mr. Ginsberg's work will survive the test of time?
He has no way of knowing. No more than some people thought Leaves of Grass would survive.
I'm asking him for his opinion, to give us an opinion on that book. He says that literary value depends on surviving the test of time. I want to know if it will.
Now, if Luther Nichols could answer that, then the good Lord could use a helper, and he ought to be up there. How can he tell?
I'm asking for his opinion as an expert.
I'll ask him.
Can you answer the question? It calls for a prediction. I think that this trial will draw attention to it. Howl perhaps will have a wider readership than it might otherwise have had, and may go down in history as a stepping stone along the way to greater or lesser liberality in the... To Ginsberg.
This video is an example of how multiple authors and influencers of the Beat generation came in defense of Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg in order to try and convince the judge of its influence, which clearly worked. This shows that Howl was very ahead of its time, and while not appreciated at first, it is now hailed as one of the most influential poems published and gave voice to those disenfranchised at the time. Born on March 24, 1919 in Yonkers, New York, Ferlinghetti was a journalism major at the University of North Carolina, and after graduating, he joined the Navy. He then went on to earn a PhD at the University of Paris in 1951. He was essential to the establishment of the Beat movement when he moved to San Francisco. In 1998, he was named the first poet laureate of San Francisco. He first heard Howl at a poetry reading in 1955 and then decided to publish it as he thought it would be an instant classic. The collection actually sold out very quickly, and as mentioned before, the second shipment of it was seized by U.S. Customs. The San Francisco Police Department arrested Ferlinghetti on charges of printing and selling lewd and indecent material. Like Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti was an advocate for being open-minded and speaking freely about who people really are and how they view the world. For example, another quote from Howl that shows this is, "Who demanded sanity trials, accusing the radio of hypnotism, and were left with their insanity in their hands in a hung jury." This is on page 18. This quote almost foreshadows the events that followed the publication. I feel like it speaks to the absurdity of criminalizing art, like music on the radio, and metaphorically taking it to a trial, only to find out that they are only making themselves crazy by reading too much into it. I feel like Ginsberg is trying to urge people to let art be art and challenge people into new ways of thinking. Art is supposed to entertain and inspire, not be censored. Allen Ginsberg was a man with an idea to give voice to people who are largely dismissed by society. Ferlinghetti was a man who supported this, and thus they were put on trial for being free thinkers and trying to deviate from the norm. In the end, the literature prevailed, and what we can take away from this is we should not have to fear censorship when we want to express ourselves artistically. Speaking for those who are put down by others will prevail.